I'm looking at the clock
Great.
over there. And tell us what you would do solution-wise. I hope you've got a raft of notes there because you're going to have the floor.
The foreign policy approach is that the U.S. and the British and similar, the Frankfurt and Paris and what have you, they have to loot the world. They have to sack and loot and exploit this planet and humanity on the planet. And the problem that they always have is you can work through puppet states in, Europe, right? There were no real independent countries left in Europe. They've all knuckled under to NATO and the European Central Bank, which gets you back to London and Wall Street. But in other parts of the world, there are nation states that fight back. And the nation state is the absolutely essential way you fight these neo-feudalist financiers. In other words, the bankers believe in neo-feudalism. The banks are at war with the modern state. And you see it most clearly in the Middle East. You look at these people like Ben Ali of Tunisia, Mubarak of Egypt, Gaddafi of Libya, Assad of Syria. What have they done, right? Most of these people, some of them at least, were puppets, if you like, of the U.S. Mubarak more or less was that, although not quite. But the problem is these are puppets that can say no. The IMF comes in and says, abolish the food subsidy, go to a free market in bread. Well, that's going to quadruple the price of bread. There are going to be riots. So Mubarak says no. Similar things like this. The nation state tends to erect a barrier against the amount of looting that the foreign bankers can impose. And
the nation state is a firewall. The nation state is a firewall.
Absolutely. And it's true for us, too. You can see this in Brzezinski. He talks about microstates, mini-states as the way to have dignity, that you got to have a microstate that looks just like you, right? If you're a Druze, you can't be part of Syria. You got to have a microstate. If you're an Alawite, not Syria, but a microstate. There's an editorial about that in the Washington Post this morning. If you're a Lebanese Maronite, got to be a special state for you. If you're a Kurd, there's got to be Kurdistan.
So divide and conquer the great game.
Divide and conquer. And Soros calls it partition studies. In other words, there's a whole academic discipline. How do you destroy the modern nation state and replace it with these rump states, microstates, mini-states, failed states?
And that's what multiculturalism is trying to get us all fighting with each other, and then the establishment plays the part of the gatekeeper, the arbiter, the referee.
Right. The left-wing version is multiculturalism, but the right-wing version is secessionism, states' rights, all this stuff. Because you push that, you're going to get the breakup of the large nation states. The British are doing this to themselves. They use the British Isles as a kind of a show window for their policies, right? Scotland, if Scotland secedes from the United Kingdom, they're not really seceding because they'll still have the Queen as the head of state. The Bank of England or the Bank of Scotland, same thing, will run the show, right? They'll still be part of the IMF. They won't have sovereignty. They'll still be in the European Central Bank. They won't, or European Union. They won't have sovereignty at all. But the idea is they'll be easier to deal with. You got to imagine if I'm J.P. Morgan Chase or ExxonMobil or Halliburton, who do I want to deal with? Do I want to deal with Syria, which is a country of 25 million people with an army and an air force, or do I want to deal with an independent Druze, Kurd, Alawite, Shiite entity? I'll deal with the little ones. In other words, the pathetic, little squabbling, impotent things that have no hope of resisting. When you play one against another, and it just becomes an endless process. So that's the idea. But there's an economic reason for that. Look what they did in Libya, right? You destroy Libya. Libya is now a shambles, but the oil contracts have now been renegotiated under terms that are worse than what Gaddafi got, worse for Libya, but better for the international multinational oil companies.
Sure, so we get to looting briefly here then. How are things going geopolitically for the globalist? What do you expect them to do in Iran?
Look, we just had a real big landmark event, right? That was last week. I think it must have been last Friday. It was the Tehran Consultative Conference on Syria. This was a landmark. I've never seen anything like this in recent decades. This is an international conference, and who's going to be there? Well, Iran are the hosts, so Iran. Russia, China, India are all represented, but it doesn't stop there. Pakistan, Mrs. Rabbani, the foreign minister, comes and she says, no foreign intervention in Syria under no circumstances. Indonesia, you've already got about half the world, but it goes on. Then you got Kazakhstan, huge place. Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Belarus. It's 30 countries, 30, and they represent half the world because you got Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Iran, right? Big, important, Venezuela, influential countries.
They're not going to the controlled UN. They're setting up their own league.
Yeah, in effect. And half of these people were at the ministerial level, you know, foreign minister, deputy foreign minister. The rest of them were ambassadors, but some of the smaller countries, right, you know, smaller Latin American countries couldn't, you know, send somebody especially for this. But this was a real big thing. And I noticed now that Hillary Clinton is more hysterical than ever, because her job is supposed to be make sure nothing like that ever happens. And now it's happened. There's a kind of I would call it a block for national independence, for state sovereignty, and national dignity.
An anti-New World Order, anti-genocide group.
Right. Yes, exactly. And it's a powerful combination. Now, obviously, there are a lot of problems, and it needs to be developed. But it's a step beyond these things like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization
and BRICS.
And the BRICS.
All right, listen, we're out of time.
Short-term and task-oriented.
We're out of time. We've already done over 30 minutes here. So I want to sit back, get into what you would do if you could convince the electorate, or if you could get the electorate to do what you wanted, or you had a magic wand. What would you do geopolitically to stop the globalists? Because even if we had the votes, they would just stage terror attacks and blame it on us. So how do you geopolitically, militarily, economically outmaneuver the globalists whose stated goal is bankrupt the world, bankrupt the family, and inject us all with cancer viruses? How do we deal with that?
And for this, we got about 30 minutes, right?
Yeah, go. You got it.
Okay. Well, the first thing is you got to have a mass movement. It's got to be an independent mass movement. Without a mass movement, there's no solution really to anything. It's got to be independent of the Republican Party, independent of every single politician in the Republican Party, and similarly, independent of the Democratic Party and independent of every single one of them. Now, obviously, as time goes on, you're going to be getting pieces of those parties to come and join you. But the idea is you're independent, and it's perfectly possible that at some point you might want to poach in the Democratic or Republican or anybody else's primary. But you need a mass movement. Now, let's look at an attempt in this direction that succeeded lately. Okay, we can think of all the ones that failed, right? Everything in the Republican primaries, Ron Paul, I think that failed. And you can also say then that on the other side, Occupy Wall Street was wrecked by ad busters and David Graeber and a bunch of anarchists and Michael Moore and these people who came in. The one that succeeded is Syriza, right? The left-wing bloc of Greece. They went from 4% to about 27, 28%. So they had almost 600% growth. And they scared the living daylights out of the whole world financier ruling class between May and June. And so this is a very, very formidable thing. They're now the opposition in Greece. The news from Greece is all bad. Austerity cuts that are done with the promise that they're going to balance the budget never balance the budget. It can't be done that way. Everybody who proposes austerity, doesn't matter who it is selling snake oil because they say, carry out my cuts and we'll balance the budget. No, you never will, because in a depression, you're just making it worse. And what the Greeks have found is that the deficit gets bigger and bigger. The more you cut this year, the bigger the deficit next year, because you're cutting. The only activity that really exists is activity around the state sector. So that's that. Now, Syriza, what can we learn from it? 5 things, I think, what you need. First of all, you need a program, and I want to talk about program more than anything. but you've got to have an actual program of demands. Notice with the Occupy Wall Street, their idea was you should not have any demands. If you have demands, you're going to be co-opted. This is absolutely insane, right? This is absolute garbage. This is the kind of thing that a ruling class counterinsurgency agent tells you to do. They usually come dressed as anarchists. So you've got to have a program. You got to have an identity. You've got to be able to talk to other people in the society and say, look, I'm not just doing this for my own narrow parochial interest, but I'm interested in fighting battles that will benefit the entire society. Okay, so we'll get to program in a minute. The second thing you need is an organization. The leadership of Syriza was able to put together 12 different groups to make a political party to get to 4% in the beginning, right, to reach critical mass. So that meant sects, groups, organizations, splinter parties, pieces of old, political formations that hadn't gone anywhere. Put them together. That was obviously a big effort because you had to convince people to give up their petty grievances and their feuds and all this other stuff. Naturally, the fact that the society was helping was collapsing probably helped. So you got to have an organization. You got to have a leader, and it turned out, or a leadership, better. That's this guy, Alexis Tsipras, who proved to be a very, very gifted politician. He took the message to Paris. He took it to Berlin. He was able to get political parties representing about 10 or 12% of the vote in France and in Germany to come on his side. And they can now form a faction in the European Parliament that can fight to take control of the European Central Bank. Because in Europe, you've got to do it internationally, right? U.S. is a little bit different, but not as different as you think. So we mentioned program. We mentioned an organization. We mentioned leadership. And then there's the question of having a strategy. And the strategy is sort of what I said before. Don't be sucked into the Republican Party or any Republican politician. Same thing for the Democrats, right? Keep yourself, as in terms of the integrity of your organization, you're separate from them. You're not them, and you don't want to be them. The other thing is don't make rotten compromises. Never, never, never join a coalition where you say, I'll take part in genocidal cuts against working people as the price for getting into this. Because if you do that, you're discredited, and that's the view. So those 4 or 5 things: program, organization, leadership, and a strategy. Now, we don't have that. People have, in the past year, people on the left and the right have wasted their time on various alternatives that turned out to be absolutely counterproductive. So you got to put away the anarchist ideology. You got to put away the right wing or whatever ideology that is, libertarianism, and get real. And real, again, is study something that actually worked. And Syriza, I think, worked in the sense it mounted a serious combative opposition to the ruling class policies, and it began to show a way out of it. The program that they had, probably don't need to go through their program. Let's focus on the program you need for the United States. We have an emergency now, right? This is a depression. As you're saying, it is getting worse. The events in terms of the finance collapse, I think they interest me less than the impact that those have on people's lives, right? On the rate of foreclosures, the standard of living collapsing, the hunger and lack of medical care, things like this. Morbidity and mortality. People are dying much faster than they should. So this is what we have to address first. Now, the first, basically for the U.S., you have about 5 complexes, and the 5th we can just talk about a little bit at the end, the international economics part. But mainly, you got to do 4 big things. Now, each of these things has various parts to it. But the first part is the anti-austerity, anti-cuts. And again, it means austerity is genocide. You have 50 million Americans. They have no job, or they're a dependent of somebody who has no job. So 30 million, you get up to 50 million.